Friends, today we are going to discuss Elizabethan lyric. The title of today's topic is Elizabethan Age was a nest of singing birds. Nest ಅಂದರೆ ಗೂಡು. So let us discuss Elizabethan lyric, Elizabethan poetry. So when we see this period, we have to compare Elizabethan period with the earlier periods, and when we do so, we realize why Elizabethan period is called golden age of English literature. When we discussed Renaissance, I have already told you how the medieval period was the period of darkness. There was no development. The religious authority was very powerful. With the fall of Constantinople in the year 1453, the Greek scholars, they ran away to Italy. They came to Italy, and when they came to Italy, they brought with them Greek and Latin literature, the classical literature, and there onwards, in Italy, in 13th century, Renaissance began. And by the time it reaches England, we see in England also there was a kind of political stability. During this period, English naval force, English Naukadala, the English naval force defeated the Spanish Armada, means Spanish naval force. This victory was very important because it created a sense of patriotism among all people, which is reflected in Elizabethan lyrics. So Elizabethan poetry was marked by freshness. There was freshness in Elizabethan poetry. There was a lot of vitality and vigor, hurupa. So it was an age of nationalism, rashtriyatva. It was an age of national enthusiasm, utsaha. It was an age of scientific discoveries. It was an age of geographical explorations. It was an age of religious upheaval. It was an age of political stability. There was a political stability. ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿ ಸ್ಥೈರ್ಯತೆ ಇತ್ತು. Queen Elizabeth, she was a great patron of literature. She supported literary writers. She encouraged these literary writers. And when we study Elizabethan lyric, we see it is totally reflected in Elizabethan lyrics. As far as scientific discoveries are concerned, Galileo, Copernicus, and other scientists, they discovered certain things, they invented certain things. Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India, Columbus discovered America. So these are the developments which are responsible for this transition from medieval period to modern period. ಬದಲಾವಣೆ, transition ಅಂದರೆ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ. The whole nation was in a state of rebirth, with the old values dead and gone, and the new values sprouting. So when we look at the history of England, 16th century history of England, we see during this period There were so many changes politically, socially, economically. In literature, also, we see these changes. So, the whole nation was in a state of rebirth because old values were dead and gone, and new values were sprouting. Chigaru. Sprouting ಅಂದರೆ chigaru. So, old values have paved way for new values. ಹಳೆಯ ಮೌಲ್ಯಗಳು ಬದಲಾಗಿ ಹೊಸ ಮೌಲ್ಯಗಳು ಅಸ್ತಿತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದವು. In the field of poetry, there was a new birth with the experiments always on the anvil. Anvil means adigalu. Experiment, ಪ್ರಯೋಗಗಳು. So, in the field of poetry also, a lot of experiments were done. With the publication of Tottel's Miscellany in 1557, we see the beginning of Elizabethan poetry. So this is a very important year in the history of English literature, 1557. Tottel was a printer. He made a collection of poems with the help of Grimald, a university scholar. So Tottel's Miscellany is a collection of poems. It is an anthology, Kavya Sangraha. So it was published in the year 1557. So Tottel was a printer. With the help of Grimald, he was a university scholar. He published this anthology which became very popular. There were all poems written by the courtiers of Henry VIII. So in this collection of poems, we see the poets were the courtiers of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the king of England during that time, and these poets were courtiers. Courtier means Magada ಅಥವಾ ಸ್ತುತಿ ಪಾಠಕರು, noblemen. So among them were the foremost and the supreme Sir Thomas Watt and the Earl of Surrey, Henry Howard. So when we look at Tottel's Miscellany, which was published in the year 1557, this is the beginning of Elizabethan 16th century English poetry. This is a collection of poems written by the courtiers of Henry VIII. Among these poets, the most important poets were Sir Thomas Watt and the Earl of Surrey. So let us look at Sir Thomas Watt. So Elizabethan poetry virtually began with the works of Watt. Virtually means vastavagi. So exactly, if we want to know when and who began Elizabethan poetry, we can say that it was Sir Thomas Watt, who was a courtier. He started writing poetry. When we look at his poetry, we see he mostly imitated Italian models, madarigalu. Sir Thomas Watt and the Earl of Surrey visited Italy. They studied Greek literature, and when they came, they started writing poetry. And when they wrote poetry, they imitated Anukarisu, Italian models. But he was not a blind follower of Italian models. He attempted a great variety of metrical experiments. As far as Sir Thomas Watt is concerned, he tried a number of metrical experiments. Experiment ಪ್ರಯೋಗಗಳು. Meter means ಛಂದಸ್ಸು. He wrote songs, madrigals, short poems, sonnets, elegies. Elegy means shokagite. It was he who brought in many new forms. So it was Sir Thomas Watt who brought new forms of poetry, prakaragalu, be it lyric, bhavagite, sonnet, sunit, elegy, shokagite. So he brought new forms of literature to England. Although his experiments were rudimentary, but judged as an early poet, he stands eminent. So, when we look at his experiments, they were rudimentary, arambhika, very, not very, what do you say, polished. His experiments were rudimentary, arambhika, prayogagalu. They were not perfect, but if we judge him as an early poet, he stands eminent, Vishesha. The next important poet of this period is the Earl of Surrey. He is to be judged as a disciple of Watt rather than an independent force. Disciple, follower, anuyayi. So when we look at the Earl of Surrey, we can say he was the follower of Sir Thomas Watt. It is these two poets who brought sonnet from Italy. So the Earl of Surrey, his sonnets are more effective than those of Watt. So Sir Thomas Watt and the Earl of Surrey, they wrote sonnets, but his sonnets are more effective than that of Sir Thomas Watt. Sir Thomas Watt wrote strictly in the Petrarchan structure, whereas Surrey invented a new structure to the sonnet. And Surrey's sonnets are called the Elizabethan sonnets. Later on, we see John Milton, John Keats, and other writers wrote Petrarchan sonnets. They followed the path of Sir Thomas Watt, whereas Shakespeare popularized Surrey's sonnets. The Petrarchan sonnets are more impressive, whereas the Elizabethan sonnets are more expressive. Abhivakti. So Elizabethan sonnets written by Shakespeare and other writers are more expressive. Surrey translated the second Aeneid into blank verse. Aeneid is an epic Mahakavya which is written in Greek language by Virgil, and Surrey translated this epic in English literature and he used blank verse. This is one of the greatest contributions of the Earl of Surrey. Surrey's invention of blank verse is an important contribution to English literature. Till then, rhymed verse was dominant. As far as meter is concerned, Chandassu, rhymed verse Antyaprasa, unrhymed Antyaprasa illada. So what is a blank verse? Blank verse is an iambic pentameter. A verse means kavya, having 5 metrical feet. In Kannada also there is meter ಛಂದಸ್ಸು. ಕನ್ನಡ ಛಂದಸ್ಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಏನು ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ, ಲಘು ಗುರು, ಲಘು ಗುರು ಇಂಥ 5 metrical feet unrhymed. So here we don't have rhymed verse. So this invention, ಈ ಅನ್ವೇಷಣೆ ಏನದಲ್ಲ ಬಹಳ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದ ಅನ್ವೇಷಣೆ. ಕಾರಣ ನಂತರದ ಕಾಲಾವಧಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ನಾಟಕಕಾರಗಳು ಅದು ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ವಿಲಿಯಂ ಶೇಕ್ಸ್ಪಿಯರ್ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಅವರೆಲ್ಲರೂ ನಾಟಕಗಳನ್ನು ಬರೀಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಈ ಬ್ಲ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ವರ್ಸನ್ನು ಬಳಕೆ ಮಾಡಿದರು. It was this blank verse which provided enormous felicity, ಬರಹದ ಮಾಧುರ್ಯ, felicity means naturalness, ನೈಸರ್ಗಿಕತೆ, to the English drama. However, though blank verse was invented by the Earl of Surrey, it was perfected by Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare. The next important poet of this period is Gascoigne. He was a man of high breeding and good elocutionist. ಒಬ್ಬ ಮಾತುಗಾರ. He came from upper class society. He carried the blank verse a step higher. His blank verse is more vigorous than Surrey's. His poetry has greater individuality than his predecessors. Predecessor means ಹಿಂದಿನವರು. So when we look at Gascoigne, his blank verse is more vigorous, having lot of vitality, hurupa. And his poetry has greater individuality, vayaktikate. His poem Flowers, Herbs and Beads, published in 1575, was an important landmark in the history of English literature. Landmark means mailugundu. So his poem, the title of this poem is Flowers, Herbs and Beads. It is one of the most important literary work of art written during Elizabethan period. The next important writer is Thomas Sackville. Thomas Sackville releases English poetry from the stiffness that predecessors were subject to. His long poem, The Complaint of Buckingham, shows both variety of power of pathos. Pathos means karuna ras. So Thomas Sackville, his poetry is rather flexible in nature. Earlier poets, when they wrote poetry, there was stiffness, sthirate. They were not rigid. They were not flexible. But Thomas Sackville was having that flexibility, and his long poem, The Complaint of Buckingham, shows both variety of power of pathos. There is pathos in his poetry. In his poem, The Complaint of Buckingham, we see there is a variety of power of pathos. But till now, there is little indication of that exuberant delight in life that is the characteristic of Elizabethan period. So this is just a beginning of Elizabethan poetry, and these writers, they were lacking that exuberance is sampada. Delight means ananda. So there came the most important writer of this period, Sir Philip Sidney. He is one of the most attractive personalities of the time. He was a soldier, a courtier, a nobleman, and a man of letter. Sir Philip Sidney was a soldier, he was a courtier, and he was a man of letter. Man of letter means writer. He wrote Arcadia, Defense of Poesy, Astrophel, and Stella. These are the three most important works of Sir Philip Sidney. In Defense of Poesy, poesy means poetry, he is the first theorist critic of England as far as criticism is concerned, Vimarshe. So, in the field of criticism, for the first time, we see in his Defense of Poesy the first theorist critic of England. His Astrophel Stella is the finest sonnet sequence that sprang out of his personal life under the circumstances similar to those of Petrarch. We have already seen Elizabethan sonnets and sonneteers, and we have already discussed Astrophel and Stella. So, Astrophel and Stella is one of the finest sonnet sequences, and it also was written in the same way as Petrarch wrote sonnets addressing his beloved. Arcadia is a poem which paved the way for the novel form in a rudimentary way. Paved means Hodesu, Needu. So Arcadia is a work of art written by Sir Philip Sidney and ಆರಂಭಿಕ ಕಾದಂಬರಿ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕರಿಬೋದಾಗಿದೆ. Though novel as a form of literature came later on, it was developed in 18th century. So in conclusion, we can say the Elizabethan age were abounded in lyrical verses, ಭಾವಗೀತೆಗಳು. So full of ತುಂಬು, abound means ತುಂಬು. ಸೊ ಎಲಿಜಬೆಥನ್ ಕಾಲಾವಧಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುವಂಥ ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ನಾವು ಅಧ್ಯಯನ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾವ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ಬಹಳ ಮಹತ್ವ ನೀಡಲಾಗ್ತಿತ್ತು. ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಅ ಪೀರಿಯಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಂಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಲಿಟ್ರರಿ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟಿವಿಟಿ. ಇಂಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್ ತೀವ್ರ. ಈ ಕಾಲಾವಧಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯಿಕ ಚಟುವಟಿಕೆಗಳು ನಡೆದವು. However, in those days, the publishers arbitrarily published these verses. Arbitrarily means manabandante. So the publishers published these poems arbitrarily. Many a times we come across, the great poem is written by this, it is published by the side of a mediocre poem. So the publishers were not aware of such things. They published these poems arbitrarily, and with the publication of Totale's Miscellany in 1557, host of such collections started coming out. So with the publication of Totale's Miscellany in 1557, a lot of such anthologies were published during 16th century. So this is your Elizabethan lyric. If we just want to see some of the names of those anthologies, here are some anthologies. The Paradise of Dainty Devices, it was published in 1576. A Handful of Pleasant Delights, 1584. The Phoenix Nest, which was published in 1593. These collections were haphazard and uncritical. Haphazard means addadiddi, uncritical, ತೀರ್ಮಾನ ಇಲ್ಲದ. So as I already told you, the publishers were not aware of the greatness of these some of these poems. They published these poems without bothering about the quality of those poems. Great poems were placed ಸೈಡ್ ಬೈ ಸೈಡ್ ಬ್ಯಾಡ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ರಿಡಿಕ್ಯುಲಸ್ ಪೋಯಮ್ಸ್. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಗ್ತೈತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಒಂದು ಒಳ್ಳೆಯ ಕಾವ್ಯದ ಬಾಜು ಒಂದು ಹಾಸ್ಯಾಸ್ಪದವಾದ ಕಾವ್ಯ ಅವರು ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದರು. ದ ಬೆಸ್ಟ್ ಇನ್ ದೀಸ್ ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ವೇರ್ ಸಾಂಗ್ಸ್. ಸೊ ಇನ್ ಆಲ್ ದೀಸ್ ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್, ಇನ್ ಆಲ್ ದೀಸ್ anthologies, ಕಾವ್ಯ ಸಂಗ್ರಹಗಳು, songs were very beautiful. So this is your Elizabethan lyric. Since Queen Elizabeth encouraged poets, the literary writers, a lot of anthologies were published during this period. So this is your Elizabethan lyric. I hope all of you have understood whatever I have discussed today. If you have any queries, you may just share with me. Thank you.